But I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. I'm really looking forward to this talk from my good friend, a dear friend of mine, John Cottingham, who's been a mentor to me in many ways and just a good friend over the years and someone whose work I really admire. So I want to begin by thanking, first of all of you again for coming out to hear this talk. I want to thank also the Department of Philosophy and the Department of Religion for co-sponsoring this. I want to thank the Hamilton Center for helping to make everything happen, and particularly I want to thank Cheryl, Emily, and Brianna, who've been behind the scenes helping to make this happen. I also want to thank the John Templeton Foundation. So this public event is our second public event in a Templeton grant I have on spiritual yearning and the problem of spiritual alienation, trying to think about the place of spiritual yearning today in a changing religious landscape where a growing number of people say they have no religion, right? But having no religion doesn't necessarily mean that one doesn't have spiritual yearning. So how should we think about spiritual yearnings in that context? Well, again, many people still do practice religion, many don't. And so how do we think broadly and generally about spiritual yearning and the spiritual life? John Cottingham, I think, is one of the most distinguished and wise commentators on these matters, and so he seemed to be the perfect person to have come give this talk. So let me introduce John. John Cottingham is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Reading and an Honorary Fellow at St. John's College, University of Oxford. He is the former President of the Mind Association, the Aristotelian Society, and the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion. And he's also former Chair of the British Society for the History of Philosophy. From 1993 to 2012, he was the editor of Ratio, an international journal of analytic philosophy. Professor Cottingham is a specialist in philosophy of religion, moral philosophy, and early modern philosophy, particularly the philosophy of René Descartes. Some of you may know René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. You please probably know that part. Very influential modern philosopher, sometimes considered to be the father of modern philosophy. John has published over 30 books, 16 as sole author, a further 9 editions and translations, plus either as single or joint editor, 8 edited collections, together with over 150 articles in academic journals or books. Professor Cottingham, you've been very busy over the course of your life. Among his books are Philosophy and the Good Life, Reason and the Passions in Greek, Cartesian, and Psychoanalytic Ethics, published with Cambridge University Press. On the Meaning of Life, which my students who are here today have read that, and I'm sure, John, they're going to have some great questions for you, some penetrating, challenging questions, so we'll look forward to that. Also, The Spiritual Dimension, Religion, Philosophy, and Human Value, Cartesian Reflections, Essays on Descartes' Philosophy with Oxford, Why Believe, Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach, also with Cambridge, How to Believe, In Search of the Soul, a philosophical essay with Princeton, and most recently, The Humane Perspective, Philosophical Reflections on Human Nature, the Search for Meaning, and the Role of Religion. And this event, I should say, is also doubling as a book launch. I did purchase 20 copies. If you promise me you're going to read the book and you talk to me afterwards, I can get you a copy of John's latest book, which is a fantastic, sort of a greatest hits. It's like AC/DC has their greatest hits album. This is sort of the AC/DC greatest hits, but for Professor Cottingham. We're also going to have a short response from another friend of mine, Professor Fiona Ellis, who is a professor and chair of philosophy at the University of Nottingham. She is currently a visiting research professor in the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. She works in the areas of philosophy of religion, 19th century German philosophy, phenomenology and existentialism, philosophy of love and desire, and debates around naturalism and supernaturalism. She is the author of Concepts and Reality and the History of Philosophy, Tracing a Philosophical Error with Routledge in 2005, God, Value, and Nature with Oxford in 2014, and the editor of New Models of Religious Understanding with Oxford in 2018. She's currently working on completing her third book monograph titled The End of Desire, Meaning, Nihilism, and God. And she has been invited, along with myself, to do the Cambridge Companion to Philosophy of Religion. So we've had a good time thinking about that together. So she's going to provide about a 5-minute response before our question and answer. She's going to prime the pump, so to speak, for our philosophical discussion and questions with Professor Cottingham. So without further ado, would you please join me in welcoming Professor Cottingham to the podium?
Thank you very much, David, for those kind words, and thank you all for coming. I hope you're not too hot. Normally when I talk in American lecture halls, it's really cold with all the aircon, but I think we have the opposite here. And thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Hamilton Centre for its hospitality, also, of course, the Templeton Foundation, who are supporting this project on spiritual alienation, and David McPherson for his kindness in inviting me. I've long been an admirer of David's work, and it's wonderful to be part of the impressive Templeton project, which he's currently leading on spiritual yearning and the problem of spiritual alienation. It's a project very much relevant to the role of philosophy in an age, role of philosophy of religion and of religion generally in an age of growing non-religion. And both the topic itself and the way in which it's being approached, I think very much in line with what in my recent work, and David referred to the latest book, I've called the humane agenda in philosophy generally, and philosophy of religion in particular. What is the humane agenda? Well, I try to make the case for a distinctive shift in the way, both in philosophical style and in methodology, perhaps most especially in the area of philosophy of religion. So you might expect that philosophy of religion, as taught in universities, would deal with some of the most profound problems of human existence. Questions about our place in the cosmos, the ultimate fate and destiny of humanity, purpose of human life, the struggle between good and evil, and the enigmas of human suffering and redemption. But the way philosophy of religion is typically taught in, I think it's fair to say, most philosophy departments in Britain and North America, can seem rather remote from these profound moral and existential questions. It can seem all very abstract. Students invariably find they're required to work through standard arguments for or against God's existence and analyze the various attributes of God, omnipotence, omniscience, and so on. And of course that work is important and not devoid of interest, but it can seem rather abstract and not to have much to do with the way religion actually operates in the life of the believer, or indeed the reasons for its rejection by those who don't accept religious belief. It's rather as if the philosophy of music, if you can imagine a course on philosophy of music, if it were to confine itself to abstract theories of musicologists without looking at the impact of music and the difference it makes to the lives of those who practice or listen to it, experience it. And I think there's a further problem about the standard approach, the arguments for or against God, that it seems to me, I don't know what your view is on this, but it seems to me they very seldom make much difference as to whether someone is a believer or not. I mean, those who already believe might be perhaps comforted by the arguments and feel they support their position. Those who are already disinclined to believe will typically find the arguments defective. But underlying that is a fundamental difference in the way the world is seen. To the non-believer, the cosmos we inhabit will typically seem to be a blank, neutral, and utterly impersonal world. And the vast, complex chain of events that gave rise to our planet will seem to manifest only blind, pitiless indifference, to use a phrase from the famous atheist Richard Dawkins. This is A on the sheet. Has everyone got a handout? I've got a sight of a handout at least. I think more may be on the way, but this is Richard Dawkins saying, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, some people will get hurt, others are going to get lucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason. The universe has just the properties we'd expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. For the believer, by contrast, despite the pain and suffering we see around us, the world is seen, and this is B on the sheet, in the words of the theologian and philosopher Judith Wolfe, a very interesting book to be published shortly. The world is seen as having, as she says there under B, an unseen depth of goodness, significance, and love, which we do not make, but in which we can participate. In other words, we don't create value, we can respond to it. Well, what I said at the beginning, that these abstract intellectual debates don't seem to make much difference to whether you side with Dawkins or with Judith Wolfe there, with A or with B. If you might think, well, if philosophical argument doesn't make any difference, then religion must be a matter of blind faith, nothing to do with evidence or reason. And that was the view of the famous philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. This is C on the sheet, who in that book, Concluding Unscientific Postscript, says that it's entirely a subjective matter. We've got to hold fast to our faith amid total uncertainty. So for him, it's not a matter of argument or evidence, just determination in holding on. Now, I think that conclusion of Kierkegaard is too hasty. Yes, there will be an element of faith in, I think, all human beliefs. But this is not to say that there's no evidence at all that might be relevant to religious belief. But the evidence, in my view, is going to be evidence of a rather special kind. It's not going to be what the American philosopher Paul Moser has called spectator evidence. That's to say the typical evidence you have in science, where you have objective observations. You can, as it were, lay the evidence there on the table, and it either supports your hypothesis or not. To demand that kind of scientific spectator evidence would be to think of God as an item in the universe that could be verified like any scientific hypothesis. But the kind of evidence that might be relevant to believing in a God worthy of worship and worthy of receiving free and unconstrained love and allegiance would be a very different kind of evidence. It might require what Moser calls cardia theology, a theology of the heart. That's to say, it's an idea really going right back to the 17th century, to Blaise Pascal, contemporary of Descartes, who said, this is E on the sheet, D there gives you the Paul Moser quote, which I just alluded to. Pascal said, c'est le cœur qui sent Dieu, et non la raison. It's the heart that grasps God, not rationality, not reason. Somewhat similarly, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in the 20th century, said that life, this is F on the sheet, life can educate you to a belief in God. And by life, he explicitly included, as he put it, suffering of various sorts. So experience. So I think the implication in both those thinkers is that conversion would only very rarely, if at all, come about through intellectual debate. It rather comes about as a result of an emotional transformation, a transformation of the heart, if you like, a radical shift of perspective that allows the world to be seen in a different way. This doesn't mean, I think, and this is an important point, talking about reasons of the heart, as Pascal does, doesn't mean that it's all an entirely irrational business, that you just arbitrarily go for one or the other. Rather, and indeed Pascal himself, just going back to E, does acknowledge a role for reason as well as the heart. We know the truth not only by reason, he says, but also the heart. That's E2 there. So how can that happen? I suggest one important way the two are connected, reason and the heart, is that the emotions can act as a catalyst for the perception of new evidence. So as a result of being emotionally transformed, the eyes may be opened to perceiving aspects of reality that were previously hidden from view. Now, there may be skeptics at this point who might say, well, if we're allowed to let emotion in this way, isn't that not really philosophically respectable? Shouldn't philosophy always be hard-nosed, detached, critically scrutinizing the data? It's surely not philosophically respectable to allow us to be swept along on the tide of emotion. But I don't think it's exactly like that. It seems to me there are many areas of life, not just religion, but many other perfectly ordinary areas of life, where we need to alter our epistemology to understand what's going on. By that I mean alter the way we view the evidence and conditions for knowledge. Instead of what I call an epistemology of detachment or control, where you stand back from the data, critically scrutinize it, and weigh it up, we may instead need an epistemology of receptivity, where in order to perceive certain things, we need to be receptive. In a certain way, emotionally receptive. And this is not just, as it were, a special ticket for religion. I think it applies to many other areas of human life. For example, if you look at H, the famous American philosopher Martha Nussbaum has argued that if you're going to appreciate a poem, the properties or qualities of a poem, you have to be, as she puts it in that quotation, humble, open, active, yet porous. You have to be porous. That's to say, you have to allow the material to affect you. If you constantly stop with each line of a poem and question it, I mean, there may be a place for critical evaluation, and there certainly is. But to some extent, you've got to give ground. You've got to open yourself in order to allow the poem, if it's going to work on you emotionally. So that porousness is crucial for proper literary appreciation. The same, I think, would apply to personal relationships. If you're trying to build a personal relationship with someone, but you always remain cold, detached, critical, trying to analyze their qualities with an epistemology of detachment, you maybe are never going to get to know them. To some extent, you have to be receptive to allow their qualities to shine through if the relationship is to get going at all. And I think a similar dynamic applies to works of art, appreciating a work of art. Of course, careful critical scrutiny and analysis is involved in appreciating literature or paintings or indeed musical works. But true appreciation of the qualities of a great work of art requires us, it seems to me, whether we like it or not, to be to some extent involved, to be receptive, to be moved by it. This doesn't mean to be gullible or lacking in discrimination or boldly accepting the first impression that comes to mind, but it does, I think, mean that we have to be prepared to be permeable, to allow the possibility that aspects of the work might have a transformative effect on us and bring us to new levels of awareness and understanding. I hope that thought makes sense if you consider how you might appreciate a work of art. If you just look at page 2 of this sheet, I've tried to explain this in an earlier book in terms of an upward spiral of understanding. In contemplating, for example, a great painting, what might have started as a mere willingness to stop and look at it becomes, as we look more carefully and certain transformations take effect, a more attentive, involved, receptive looking, and then it might turn into a delighted looking as the properties of the painting start to work on us. So as we progress up the spiral of committed attention, we allow ourselves to undergo further interior change. And this may in turn lead to new levels of perception and further awareness of additional dimensions in the work we are contemplating. So it's a process of transformation, interior transformation, as much as it's a process of detached scrutiny. I hope that distinction is reasonably clear. Well, let's go back to religion now. I mean, some people may feel this makes it all rather rose-tinted, it would be nice perhaps to think that if we're open, receptive, porous, then the world will manifest itself to us as full of love and beauty and wonder, charged with the grandeur of God, to use that phrase from the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. But for many people, perhaps for all of us at certain times in our lives, the world is not like that. It's an alienating and scary place. Another poet, Hopkins' near contemporary, A.E. Housman, gave vivid voice to that fear. This is K on the sheet, where he said how, in one of his poems, "How am I to face the odds of man's bedevilment and God's? I, a stranger and afraid, in a world I never made." I, a stranger. Long before Hopkins, this kind of view had already found expression in the philosophy of Hegel, in that abstract noun, Entfremdung, alienation, estrangement. But what exactly does alienation involve? What is it to be alienated in the way you can sense in that poem of Housman? Well, David Macpherson in his current work helpfully draws our attention to 3 types of alienation: from ourselves, from others, and from the world. And I want to just focus on the third of those, alienation from the world, which I think has special philosophical interest. How do we feel about our relationship to the world we inhabit. I think most of us would have to say that our relationship is profoundly, or our feelings about it, are profoundly ambivalent. On the one hand, the human predicament involves a feeling of helplessness, vulnerability, fear, in the face of a best indifferent and often dangerous and hostile world. On the other hand, the world we live in does call forth responses of wonder and joy at the beauty and goodness to be found in the world, despite all the scariness. So there is that from which we feel alienated, but there is also that towards which we feel somehow drawn, emotionally and even morally and aesthetically drawn. So the alienating aspect, let's think about that for a moment, connected with fear and helplessness. Well, in the past, that was often connected, I think, with the plight of human beings faced with earthquakes, storms, and generally stuff they couldn't control or master. They felt like a tiny, insignificant speck against these vast natural forces. But since the technological revolution of the early modern period and onwards, that kind of helplessness has to a large extent been mitigated. We have started, it seems, to fulfill the dream that Descartes outlined in his first published work, the Discourse on the Method, the Discours de la Méthode, published in 1637 anonymously. He thought there that the rise of science, technologically based science founded on a mathematical physics, would one day make us, as he put it, masters and possessors of nature. Maître et possesseur de la nature. That's L. I've given you the quotation there. Well, to some extent, that's happened. But the sense of alienation still persists, I think. Why is that? Well, I think there are many reasons, but I'll just mention two. The first, which begins to surface in the ecological literature, starting with James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis of the 1960s, and increasingly felt down to the present day, is that the very scientific and technological revolution that was supposed to cure our alienation has paradoxically landed us with a new and more disturbing form of alienation. For in trying to control nature, we've ended up separating ourselves from it. Something other than ourselves to be manipulated and coerced into serving us. As that phrase of Descartes, which now sounds, I think, rather sinister, masters and possessors of nature. We've, as it were, separated ourselves from the natural living web, of which we humans are a part. Ian McGilchrist, who I think is one of the most interesting thinkers of our time, if you haven't read it, I recommend his The Master and Its Emissary. The quotation I've given you an M there is from his later magnum opus, The Matter with Things, published a few years ago. Although we're inextricably a part of it, we have abandoned nature. Nature, not some abstract, eviscerated, bureaucratic entity known as the environment, which exists to be managed and exploited, but nature that is our mother, our healer, and our home, as well as our ultimate fate, the great whole to which we belong. I think there's a kind of image of that alienation in that default image. I don't know if this is true in the US, but in Britain, if you subscribe to Apple TV, the default image is a moving video loop of downtown Los Angeles. And it's clearly intended by Tim Cook and his techno geeks to be a wonderful, impressive symbol of how far we've come. But in actual fact, the image seems to me is of a kind of hell planet, where there's not one single green tree or living thing, just artificial lights and moving lights of automobiles and concrete towers. So not one living human presence to be discerned. So what I suggest has happened is that we've replaced the involuntary alienation that our ancestors, when they were just cowering in their caves, with a kind of willed, self-created alienation, which has cut us off from the very source that nourishes and sustained us. Now, maybe it's not a philosophical question, it's a kind of socio-political question, whether that can be solved. I mean, it may be that the technology which has got us this far will find solutions to this and somehow help us to restore respect for the environment and the nurturing and caring, the stewarding of the planet. And suppose that is, let's take the optimistic scenario. Supposing it all works out okay and we stop concreting over every surface we can find, manage to create a future in which we are attuned to the natural world instead of trying to control it. Would that solve the problem of alienation? Well, I think even in that ideal future scenario, there would still be a more profound sense of alienation, which could be called metaphysical or cosmological alienation, if you like. The poet Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, pointed to this in his Duino elegies. This is N for November on the sheet, where he says, "Und die findigen Tiere merken es schon, dass wir nicht sehr verlässlich zu Haus sind in der gedeuteten Welt." The beasts, the animals notice that we are, quite soon, that we are not very securely at home in the interpreted world, in the world that's interpreted through language. I don't presume to decipher exactly what Rilke may have meant by that, but I think one clear implication is that there's something weird about human beings. There's something strange. Unheimlich is the German term, uncanny, that even the animals can dimly sense. And you could perhaps put that by saying the animals know why we're here, but human beings have no idea why we're here. I mean, of course, the first part of that claim is not quite true. The animals don't know why they're here. Being non-concept using beings, they don't have conceptual knowledge of that sort, but they simply unquestioningly get on with the business of living to pursue the goals characteristic of their species. But we humans, even if we were successfully to attain all the goals that we have an innate drive to pursue, food, drink, reproductive success, physical comfort, social companionship, and even if we gained maximum satisfaction from what John Stuart Mill somewhat arbitrarily called the higher pleasures, pleasures of intellect and culture and creative pursuits, even then a certain restlessness, I put it to you, would remain. Each of us would still, to borrow a phrase from the German theologian Karl Rahner, this is O on the sheet, each of us would still confront the totality of the world silently, helplessly, anxiously. That idea of confronting the totality of the world reminds us of the argument of another German Catholic theologian, philosopher, Josef Pieper, that he said, quote, "Fixing the mind's eye on the totality of being," end quote, is the essence of the philosophical impulse. So this is, I'm trying to get at here, is the root of this metaphysical or cosmological alienation. In theological terms, it finds expression in the Judeo-Christian tradition. For example, in St. Anselm, way back in the Middle Ages, who, echoing the Genesis story of the expulsion of Adam and Eve, sees the human condition as one where we're expelled from our homeland into exile. Anselm says, "What shall this man do, the exile of thine far from thee? Quid faciet iste tuus longinquus exul," he says, addressing God. What will this exile far from you do? And the theme continues right down to Martin Heidegger in the 20th century, for whom, in the words of the theologian George Patterson, our experience of being far from home enters into the very constitution of philosophy. So it's part of our very nature as human beings to be alienated from the world, in the sense we feel a kind of vertigo as we stand before the total of everything that is the case. You know, Wittgenstein's first sentence in the Tractatus, "The world is everything that is the case." The very boldness or blankness of this being the case, the fact that we're here at all, the fact that there's a world at all, is a kind of mystery, as in fact Wittgenstein ended up admitting at the end of the Tractatus, where the whole logical apparatus he'd elaborately constructed ends in an irreducible mystery, as he put it. It's not on the sheet. Not how the world is mysterious, but that it exists at all. We confront the mystery of actual existence, being here, as a mystery we know we can never fathom. In the workshop on alienation held here in June, one of today's most brilliant philosophers of religion, Eleanor Stump, American philosopher, raised the objection that these sorts of existential concerns I've been agonizing over are in effect a luxury pursuit, available only to pampered Westerners, because most human beings are so busy getting on with the business of survival. That, of course, is true, but I think it would be a mistake to dismiss the problem of cosmological alienation as merely a parochial concern of pampered Westerners. Like most philosophical problems, having the time and resources to reflect on them is, of course, a privilege. But it doesn't mean that the problems are not genuine, authentic ones, or that they don't relate to genuine, intrinsic problems of our human predicament. And I think one reason why great myths such as the expulsion from Eden endure down the centuries is that they capture universal features of the human predicament that resonate at some level with us, not just with philosophers or academics, resonate at some level with all of us. So that's the kind of alienation I'm talking about, which, incidentally, let me just say, it can't be solved by science. Stephen Hawking, the great physicist, once said that a grand theory of everything, combining quantum theory and Einstein's relativity, would explain why there's a universe at all. But of course, I hope you agree with this, maybe you don't. That seems to be a fantasy. A set of equations can never, however elegant, however well they subsume the phenomena, could never, as it were, magic the cosmos into being out of nothing. Nor, incidentally, are quantum fluctuations in a vacuum. You know, some physicists say we can show how from quantum fluctuations in a vacuum there comes matter. Thereby we can show how you can get something out of nothing. But of course, quantum fluctuations in a vacuum are not nothing. There's already something structured there. Nor, incidentally, I think, can theology solve the problem. You can, of course, introduce God, but God is the mysterious source of actual existence, not a scientific or other rational explanation for existence. As Herbert McCabe says, the Dominican theologian and philosopher, this is the last quote on the sheet, P, when we speak of God, we don't clear up a puzzle, we draw attention to a mystery. So, how might this problem of cosmological or metaphysical alienation be overcome? I think it can't be overcome if it's addressed as an abstract intellectual puzzle. I think, going back to this idea of the humane perspective, the engaged, receptive stance, rather than the detached, abstract intellectualizing stance, I think it has to be approached from an embodied perspective, taking account of the reality of the human condition. We are not abstract, Cartesian, immaterial intellects. We're creatures of flesh and blood, embodied in the natural world of which we are a part. So the answer, I think, cannot be in theorizing. It has to be in practice, in praxis. And this connects with one of the major themes of the Templeton Project on alienation, based at this institution, the crucial importance of spirituality and spiritual practices. As I said earlier, I think most of us have this ambivalence about the world. It's both scary and yet we respond to its beauty and goodness. And I think spiritual practices at their best kind of provide a way of overcoming alienation by enacting two things. First, they enact a posture of humility and dependence before a reality that's greater than ourselves and which we can't presume to control or appropriate. In the words of one of the Psalms, it is He that hath made us and not we ourselves. So that's the posture of humility. Just to add a caveat to that, it's important that that be authentic humility, not a manipulative posture of trying to get something by manipulating a supposed powerful deity into granting your requests by some magical route. That would be what the philosopher Mark Johnson has aptly called spiritual alienation. And the second aspect of spiritual practices, I think, is that they express the more positive aspects of our ambivalent feelings, namely those spontaneous feelings upwelling of joy and elation at the goodness and beauty to be found in the world in spite of everything. So I think I would suggest that spiritual practices at their best are a way of somehow encapsulating our deepest feelings about our relationship to the world by a sort of symbolic fusion of the positive and the negative aspects, the fearful submission and the hopeful joy. And if we think of the chanting of the Psalms as a paradigm case of that, if you think of, for example, Psalm number 29 or 28 in the Vulgate numbering, it talks about God being one who breaks the cedars, who shakes the wilderness and strips the forest bare, while all in the temple cry glory. That word glory in Hebrew, kavod, signifies something weighty with significance, sacred, mysterious. So the chanting of the word combines the fear and the trembling with elation and hope, so transmuting terror and alienation into a form of joyful worship. So spiritual praxis enacts and accomplishes the transcending of alienation. Just one very brief word before I close. I've ended by invoking traditional spiritual practices. That may seem OTOs or just wishful thinking in our increasingly secularized culture. That brings us back to this title, Philosophy of Religion in an Age of Growing Non-Religion. The practices, of course, are still available, but for an increasing number of people, it seems they've lost their power to command allegiance. Their appeal is diminishing. I've no easy answer for this. You can, of course, be spiritual without being religious, as the modern cliche has it. And it's not for a philosopher, I think, to lay down the law about what should be the preferred forms of spiritual practice, which you might adopt. Nevertheless, it's not easy, I think. The hard truth is, I think it's far from easy to find viable substitutes for traditional forms of spirituality. And talking of remedies for alienation could suggest a utilitarian or instrumental view of spiritual praxis, as a kind of welfare enhancer, or something that produces wellness, in that kind of annoying contemporary term. But to be a candidate for a mode of life that figures, that doesn't just offer an instrumental shortcut for relieving symptoms of alienation, but truly responds to the needs of the human soul. Spiritual praxis must flow from an authentic stance of focused humility before the mystery of existence. And the traditional vehicles for that are ones, it seems to me, that we discard at our peril. So such spirituality, I'm not claiming it produces a propositional answer to the puzzle of our existence, because there is no such answer. But it does offer, I think, a series of practices, liturgical rituals, whereby human beings are able to express how they stand in relation to the mystery of existence. In such practices which resonate with us on many levels, some below the threshold of rational understanding, they turn what might have been angry or helpless puzzlement or nihilistic despair, the hallmarks of alienation, into a joyful expression of hope, thereby allowing us to reach towards the transcendent source of meaning that the hungry human spirit longs for. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for that beautifully literate and, I should say, humane philosophical reflection for all of us. So I'm going to invite Professor Fiona Ellis to come, and she's going to give a few remarks before opening it up to everyone. If you want to ask some questions, we'd welcome that. I should say, my students, make sure you get the QR code. I think most of you got it, but some came in late, so for checking in. But Fiona, this does not fit on her.
Is it working?
Is that working? Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay. Is the microphone working?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to David McPherson and to the Hamilton Centre for providing such generous support for my visiting fellowship and for giving me the opportunity to work on this important research project on spiritual yearning. and the problem of spiritual alienation. As Professor Cottingham has pointed out, the work we're all doing is hugely relevant to the role of philosophy of religion in the present time. John's lecture, I'll call you John, John's lecture is characteristically deep and brilliant. It gives a sense of the groundbreaking work he's done in philosophy of religion, transforming it from a dry and tedious conceptual exercise concerning the nature of God and arguments for God's existence, to an area of philosophy which engages with the most fundamental questions we face as human beings. John concedes to the interests of continental philosophy in this regard, and his lecture gives a sense of the importance of figures like Heidegger, Rana, and Rilke, all of whom agree that we're not at home in our interpreted world. It's central to all of these figures, and to John too, that it's possible nonetheless to make sense of and to inhabit, quotes, an authentic stance of focused humility before the mystery of existence. That comes from John. John ends his paper with a discussion of how authentic spiritual praxis might help us to overcome our metaphysical alienation from the world by giving expression, on the one hand, to our fear and dread in the face of a reality we can't control, and on the other hand, to the joy and wonder we feel towards that same reality. He illustrates such spiritual praxis with reference to the chanting of the Psalms, acknowledging that those who are spiritual but not religious will struggle to see the point of such traditional spiritual practices. These dissenters, and their numbers are growing in the West, do not believe that the transcendent source of meaning that we long for, as John puts it, exists. They do not believe that God exists. And some of them would deny that they even feel such longing. What are we to make of these sceptical attitudes? Do they undermine the position John is seeking to defend? Or is there a way of diminishing the extent of the disagreement between these supposedly warring factions? A skeptic like Nietzsche, another continental philosopher, will take John's commitment to theism to be a mark of false consciousness. But what if he's mistaken? A lot of philosophers work on the assumption that it's just obvious that it's a mark of false consciousness to believe in God. But, what if they're wrong? And what if it's equally mistaken to assume, as many assume, that the truth of atheism can be taken for granted and that our spiritual longings can be understood without making the unnecessary detour through theism? John will be the first to insist that these questions cannot be resolved through intellectual argument alone. His idea that progress might be made by taking seriously and also by engaging in traditional spiritual practice seems to me to be eminently worthy of consideration. And that's the end of my introduction, but I think it's okay for me to begin the questions with a question. And one thing that struck me at the beginning of your talk, John, when you were talking about Dawkins, is that you made it sound as if there was just this kind of either-or choice. Either you're a theist and you can understand the world as you want to encourage people to understand it, or you're an atheist like Dawkins and everything's just meaningless. But it's more complex than that, isn't it? Because a lot of the spiritual but not religious people see the world in precisely the terms you're wanting to encourage us to see it in, as a source of wonder and as a wonderful place, an enchanted world. And of course there are spiritual but not religious people who see it in the way that some of Nietzsche's nihilists see it, as blankly meaningless, and they feel the loss of God. But a lot of spiritual but not religious people are not like that. And I just wonder how you relate their attitude, which sounds feels very similar to the kind of attitude you want the theist to be able to make sense of and occupy. How you see the relation between that kind of stance, which on the surface doesn't involve belief in God, and the stance of your theist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for those kind words. And a very interesting question raised at the end there. Yes, I mean, clearly it's not just an either-or. Indeed, in fairness to Richard Dawkins, he himself in some of his writings does talk about the wonder of what is uncovered by science, both in the biological world, and he talks about the Milky Way. I think it's in that book, Rivers Out of Eden, where he says, you see that strip of white across the sky, but once you realize what it is, it just blows your mind with wonder and amazement. And of course, so it's not that you either have to be struck by the beauty and wonder of the world or just think it's all a meaningless horror. There are a whole spectrum of positions. However, the issue I wanted to focus on was this sense of transcendence. That's to say that even after we fully take account of everything that we see in the world around us, everything that's disclosed by literature and by science, there's still a mystery. There's something in the human spirit which wants to reach beyond. And it's that longing for transcendence which seems to me a part of what it is to be human. So even if you are presented with a complete theory of everything in the universe, you could still, at least in your thought, reach forward and think beyond those boundaries. For a human being, it can never be finally wrapped up. There's something in the human mind that will always raise a further question. Why is the totality here at all? What is the ultimate source of it all? And of course, you can have those yearnings for transcendence without believing that the transcendent source, if there is one, is a source of goodness as well. And that, I think, is perhaps the additional factor that makes a religious person religious, that they hold on, at least in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, that they hold on to the thought that goodness is somehow sovereign in this transcendent reality. And of course, no one has to make that step. One could acknowledge the mystery, but just say it's a mystery and there's no moral or aesthetic quality to it, as it were. There's nothing about it which leads us to say that it's good or it's the source of goodness. And I think Dawkins would take that latter position. He might be prepared to go as far as to acknowledge transcendent longings. I don't think he actually does in any of his writings, but if he did, I think he wouldn't concede that there also might be a source of goodness there. So it's a brief answer to a very interesting question.
John, would you like to field your own question?
Yeah, by all means, or you can, yeah, okay.
Yes, thank you so much for the talk. I really appreciate the array of thinkers that you painted. So I really like the transition that you made from being far more concerned with propositional argumentation to something that is obviously considering the full range of phenomenology that man is experiencing and so forth. And one thinker that I am very reminded by when you were speaking, especially with that methodology in mind, is the American pragmatist William James, specifically with a mind to focus more on the experiences specifically of religious people, as is one of the titles of his books, The Varieties of Religious Experiences, tells us. And something that I also connect is something like William James's cognate works, where he talks about something like the sentiment of rationality, and I think he gets into this in his more foundational works, like in Pragmatism and so forth, where he talks about something akin to how viewing a oneness with reality, so like maybe a Heimlichkeit as opposed to an Unheimlichkeit, or as he would paint it, like a romanticist who is set against reality, so like more of a Unheimlichkeit, is something that boils down for him to a equally subjective stance towards reality that is at heart emotional. And I'm reminded also of Soren Kierkegaard's kind of thesis that you mentioned of religion is blind faith in that emotional whirlpool perhaps. And I suppose in that context of William James's approach to alienation, or at least how man makes sense of his own alienation. I'd be curious to ask, how do you situate yourself in relation to William James? Do you see him as allied with what this kind of more broad methodological approach of being less concerned with the propositional content and more concerned with the phenomenological? Do you see this more allied or?
Right. Yeah, I'm no expert on James, but picking up, thank you for the very interesting question, that's great. Picking up on the idea of the emotional there, I think what I'm trying to suggest in the paper is a sort of bridge between those who put the stress on our emotional response and those who go for as it were, coldly rational response. And the bridge works as follows, that the emotions can, as it were, prepare us, ready us up for the perception of things which were before occluded. So as a result of being emotionally open, you may start to discern evidence that wasn't before available. So you mentioned the phenomenology of all this, but phenomenologically, the world reality, it seems to me, presents itself to us as not just a projection of our own feelings, but something not of ourselves which calls forth emotions. So our emotions are essentially emotions, for example, of joy, elation, wonder at the beauty of the world. The sorts of things that the poet Wordsworth talks about when he confronts the wonders of nature. These present themselves phenomenologically as responses, not, as David Hume might have said, just our own internal projections. You know, in that passage in Hume where he talks about us gilding and staining with our own sentiments the objective, as if we kind of put it onto the world. Rather, I'd suggest they're responses, and therefore that does kind of bridge the idea of the emotions playing the role and the idea of evidence and reason playing a role. Does that perhaps go some way to answering?
Amanda, do you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So in your work, you speak of the primacy of praxis as a pathway for the reluctant non-believer to seek religion. How would you delineate between this epistemology of receptivity for adopting religion out of a rational yearning versus arguments like those put forth by philosopher Richard Norman, that the primacy of praxis may allow the potential for self-conditioned brainwash of an arbitrary religious belief? And if we seek to listen to these religious yearnings that we have for a higher power, how do we choose what praxis to embrace?
Thank you very much. Wow, that's a very rich question. Yes, the primacy of praxis, I think, works as follows, that, as I said in connection with Martha Nussbaum, to some extent you've got to go along with the poem or the work of art and allow it to affect you. In other words, you've got to engage with it rather than always remaining at the critical distance. But I think, I mean, I didn't have time to go into this in the paper, but I think there's then got to be a kind of oscillation between emotion and reason. Reason is essential, and it seems to me it's an essential part of the philosophical process. So critical rationality, as Ian McGilchrist, who I quoted at one point, puts it, critical rationality is the quality control department. So, as with any commitment, you can start by being open, being prepared to be committed, but of course your commitment could be to something that's not worthy of it. So there has to be a space for pulling back and critical reflection. McGilchrist puts it in terms of the left brain and the right brain, which some philosophers don't like very much. But I think it's a convenient shorthand for saying there are two ways of approaching the world. One is intuitive, empathetic, imaginative, receptive. So it links in with the epistemology of involvement. The other is analytic, detached, critical, distanced. But although he thinks that the second, the left brain, has gained too much control in our contemporary culture, he doesn't say it should be discarded. He thinks, after all, the two hemispheres of the brain work together, if you're going to use that model. And so he's suggesting that both are needed. And I'd certainly agree with that. So the primacy of praxis doesn't lead to, I don't think, to disastrously negative consequences. But thank you for the question.
Roman, and then over here. So I think we have time for two more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cottingham, for the talk. That was really beautiful. I wanted to ask, what does your own personal experience look like as you've hopefully applied what you've espoused in terms of what religious experiences have you allowed yourself, or allowed to permeate yourself in the spirit of coarseness as you're talking about?
Well, autobiography is always a bit difficult. And I think, actually, these things are not particularly personal or idiosyncratic. I think most of us, it's rather like this question, have you ever had an epiphany, a great spiritual experience? And clearly these aren't day-to-day things, they're by their nature special. But I think in most people's lives, at least at some points, there can be what the poet Wordsworth called spots of time, when we're overwhelmed by the beauty of the natural world, or experiences where we're swept along by great music or great literature to believe that there is a goodness and a beauty at the heart of things. I've lost my handout there, but in quotation B there, Judith Wolfe talks about beholding in the world an unseen depth of goodness, significance, and love. And I think these aren't, as it were, idiosyncratic experiences for a few, that in some form or another, such experiences come to most people. So I would claim that this is a kind of relatively universal feature of human experience. What specifically religious practices do, I think, is to provide a regular, daily, weekly, yearly, focused structure as vehicles for those sorts of experiences. And clearly that will, whether you go for that, will be partly a matter of temperament. So I don't think there's a universal answer to, there's no, as it were, perfect form of spiritual praxis which will suit everyone.
One on this side, John. I hate to pick the last one, so I'm going to let you do it.
I think it's Wayne, isn't it? Yes. Hi.
And we can stay long after if people want to ask John some more questions.
So I'm actually currently teaching the course in philosophy of religion.
Right.
So I'm really curious as to what difference you think it actually makes to include what you're calling not spectator evidence, but what was the other term? I forget. But the stuff about certain kinds of experience. So, I think I do teach the course in a way it's pretty typical, look at arguments. But one of the arguments we look at is discussions of experience.
Right.
So I'm not sure why you think that would make that much of a difference. Now, you might say the big thing that might make a difference is if you yourself have the experience, right? And that opens up evidence to you. But I have trouble seeing how that could make that much of a difference. If you can describe the experience to other people and the evidence you thereby discern, well, they have access to it that way.
Sure.
And if you think that's not good enough, then you shouldn't trust your own memory of your previous experience either. So far as I can tell, it shouldn't make that much of a difference.
Right. No, that's a very valid question. I think it partly depends on your view of God generally. I mean, I think what I think could be called classical theism, the kind of theism you find in Aquinas and his followers, in fact, does allow full scope for this idea of the mystery of existence, because of the apophatic, in the apophatic tradition, there is something ultimately mysterious about the deity. So I think one can plug into that. What I think a lot of contemporary philosophy of religion is suffering from is that it's been hijacked by what one might call Swinburnian theism. I better be careful if this is being recorded, but that's to say the view that God is sort of much like a human being, except lives for a bit longer and has various plans and gives us a certain amount of suffering in order to make us... and that, I think, to some extent, I mean, you could, if you're being dramatic, call it idolatrous. We're creating a model of God which doesn't correspond to the mysterious source of goodness and being. But the other disadvantage of it is that it, well, perhaps I've said enough, it takes us too far away from it. So in teaching philosophy of religion, I'd like there to be more emphasis on what I call classical theism, rather than the modern personalistic theism, which I think gets us all down all sorts of blind alleys. Particularly, I mean, there are a lot of further questions that could be raised, but I hope I've given you a general answer where I go, indication of where I go. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we probably need to wrap up because this was to go to 5:45. But I want to thank everyone for coming out today. For your questions, again, we can linger on a little bit if you have some further questions. But thanks so much for coming out. And